Hi and welcome to this video tutorial. I'm Ron Vellon, and this module is part 2 of negotiation planning and strategy. In part 1, we took a high-level view of the main components that go into planning and ultimately creating a plan for any negotiation. In this part, what we're doing is looking a little more closely at strategies and tactics. Again, this is a high-level view. And what we'll be doing is discussing what strategies are, what tactics are, what are the differences. Ultimately, we'll be moving toward thinking more strategically for all of our negotiations. So let's begin by taking a look at the difference between strategies and tactics. From the negotiation point of view, in a negotiation context, what do we mean by strategy? Strategy on one level means the overall plan to accomplish your goals during a negotiation. Tactics are a short-term adaptive move, and you'll probably have several tactics that you use paired up with one specific strategy. So we need to understand that tactics are subordinate to strategy. In other words, think of strategy as like an umbrella. And with it, you might have 2, 3, 4 tactics that you use. Typically, you start with at least 2 because they tend to work together. And we'll be discussing this in more detail in other modules, specifically the ones on chapters 2 and chapter 3, where we get into the details of strategies and tactics for both integrative negotiation or mutual interest negotiation, as well as distributive bargaining, sometimes thought of as sort of a more compromising approach. Going back to our diagram, we see that we have 1 or 2 or 3 or more tactics that are governed by the strategy you're choosing. And again, we'll go into more detail as to what these strategies and tactics look like in other video tutorials. But really need to understand that the tactics you're choosing need to be driven by the strategic consideration. In other words, strategy rules and tactics support your strategy. Let's look now at one main starting point when it comes to discussing strategy. There are 2 fundamental approaches. One is what we call a unilateral choice. When we're thinking about the strategy we want to use when we come at it from this point of view, we're making the decision without any kind of involvement of the other party. In other words, we're not really thinking about the other party or what they might be like. We're just not taking that a lot into consideration. We may have a favorite strategy we like to use, and quite often, I would argue most people who haven't had any formal training in negotiation learn a lot by trial and error. We learn a lot about negotiation when we're children, with our parents, with our siblings, cousins, friends, whatever. And sometimes we never change our approach. I've met people over the years who tell me, when I put up a big fuss and act childish, I get what I want. And this is an adult, someone who is older than 30. We will go with what we think works if it continues to work. And we'll often make these choices unilaterally, we say, without really thinking about the context or what's going on. And the reality is we may simply not know any other strategy. So something to think about. Bilateral considers the information we have about the other party. And this is what we're teaching, which is to think about the context. Who am I negotiating with? Who's my opponent? What's the environment? What is the cultural impact if there's a different culture that we're negotiating with? Are they from a different culture? Do they perhaps have a different approach to negotiation that I don't have? Is there something I need to learn? All of these things are taken into consideration. And so when we're creating a plan, we want to think about who we're negotiating with, and we can still go back to our favorite strategy if that's what we want to do. It's completely our choice. But at least understand why you're choosing it and making the decision to say, yes, this is the most effective way to go. In reality, when you get into a negotiation, you'll know when you start doing a plan that you're going to have a backup plan. You're going to have a strategy that you've thought of as your backup if your first one isn't working very well. It's always important to have that backup. And if your plan goes completely off the rails and you're totally surprised by what's going on, you might go to a third or fourth different strategy if the whole thing becomes, chaotic and is simply not working. But hopefully, if you think about it thoroughly, your first or second strategy should be effective. And it's not unusual to shift strategies during a negotiation and even shift back, just depending on how things go. Another model that is helpful to keep in mind when we're going into a negotiation and we're trying to figure out what our strategy and tactics are going to be is something called the dual concerns model. This is not a strategy. This is simply a framework that helps us see the negotiation we're entering into, taking into account two main considerations. The first one is what we call the substantive outcome. And you know from our previous module for this chapter content that we talked a bit about substantive goals. That word substantive means what you're really trying to get out of the negotiation in concrete terms. You think about what you're negotiating about and what you want to leave with, what would be in an agreement when you're done. The relational outcome is another consideration. And we did talk about this before as well in the previous module when we talked about how from culture to culture, often the biggest difference in negotiation is not so much the mechanics of it, but how they see and value the relationship component in the negotiation and that impact on the strategies and tactics that are used. So the dual concerns model says, what is that relationship? If you feel the relational outcome is important and the substantive outcome is equally important, you're probably coming at it from the point of view of collaboration. Very important to note here, collaboration from a technical point of view is not what we would label a strategy. It is a category of strategies. And one of my little pet peeves about the book and the way it's written is they throw the word strategy around in a lot of different ways. So one of my goals here is to clarify in this video tutorial what we mean when we talk about strategy. Collaboration, think of it as an attitude, because there are actually a number of strategies and tactics that can help you take a collaborative approach in your negotiation. So let's consider it a point of view or a perspective. If the relational outcome is really, really important, and the substantive outcome is not important, we'll probably adopt an approach that's very accommodating. Now, this language may sound familiar if you've ever done the conflict handling self-assessment. There's several versions around, and they tend to use very similar language. Accommodation is simply meaning giving in to whatever the person wants because we're really thinking about the relationship, and it supersedes any of the other more substantive possibilities and outcomes there. And so we're really kowtowing to the person and saying, whatever you want is fine. That's in the extreme. If the relational outcome is not important here, and the substantive outcome is really important, we get this idea of competition or being competitive. And what this means is that we are putting our interests front and center and going for what is important to us in the negotiation and not considering the relationship all that much. It doesn't mean we want to inflict pain in some way or have the person leave with a horrible deal. We're just not thinking about them very much. This often happens with really simple transactions, buy, sell things. If you buy or sell something on Craigslist or other sites like eBay, you may not even have any real contact with the vendor. If you are a seller, you may not even know who your purchaser is. It might just be a bunch of emails and electronic transactions. The last one, if we don't have any real interest in a substantive outcome, a concrete gain, and we don't have a lot of interest in the relationship, we'll probably avoid the whole thing. It does not mean that we're running away out of fear necessarily, although that is often the case. This is why in the conflict handling instrument, avoidance is often seen as we're trying to avoid a bad situation. Because the reality is, if it's not a bad situation and it's fairly pleasant, that means there's a bit of relationship there intact, and we probably will express some interest and engage at least on some level. But avoidance simply means you're not engaging at all. The book sometimes says that it's an avoidance strategy. Let me say this to you right now. Avoidance is not a negotiation strategy. It's a strategy to not negotiate. If you're working on a plan and you're actually engaged in the negotiation, you can't put it in, well, my strategy is going to be to avoid it. That makes no sense. So avoidance, not a strategy. To summarize what we've been talking about here, we have below the 4 different approaches. I'm calling them approaches, even though the book I think refers to them as strategies, but that's just confusing. The first approach, avoidance, not a strategy. It's a way of not engaging, which might be a good strategic choice, but in a negotiation plan, you wouldn't put in avoidance because you're already engaged with the negotiation. Competition, it's basically an I win, you likely will lose as long as I get what I want. This is sometimes referred to as forcing, depending on the self-assessment, if you ever do one on conflict handling. What this really means is you're out for yourself, and nothing wrong with that, especially for simple transactions. Just be aware that it might have an impact. Collaboration, again, not a strategy. This is about wanting to work with the other party to find something that's really mutually beneficial. In other words, everybody gets more than they might have even expected. And that's by helping each other get to some kind of win-win agreement. Now remember, collaboration is sometimes thought of as a strategy. In the book that we're using, specifically when you get into integrative negotiation in chapter 3, collaboration is a category of strategies. In other words, collaboration is equivalent to integrative negotiation in terms of terms. So within that context, there are several strategies and many tactics that allow you to engage with a collaborative negotiation. But don't put in collaboration as a strategy. That's too vague. You're getting a bit of a pattern here, aren't you? None of these are really strategies. And the last one about accommodation, this is really about giving in, as we noted before. From a negotiation point of view, giving in is not necessarily a strategy on its own. It's something that we might do if we're compromising. We might give in a little bit here and there, but it's usually not there on its own, because if you walk into a negotiation from an accommodation point of view, you're actually not really negotiating very much. You're basically giving the person what they want. So again, not a real strategy. The next 3 visuals we're going to look at simply reiterate and re-clarify what we've been talking about all along. So if we look at alternative situational strategies, this is what we've been talking about so far. So think of this as kind of a review. And it's important to be really clear about this. With the dual concerns model that we looked at a few minutes ago, it offers us a way or a framework to see our relationship to both the substantive outcomes we're hoping to achieve and the relationship we have with our opponent and how valuable that is to us. So these are what these 2 questions are here. How much concern do I have for achieving my desired outcomes? And how much concern do I have for the current and future quality of the relationship with the other party? So keep those things in mind. That will help you make the decisions. And typically our simulations are fairly easy to sort out. In real life, it may not be so clear. So keep that in mind. And again, to repeat it for the 3rd or 4th time, the dual concerns model is not a strategy. It's a way for understanding how we're approaching the negotiation and will help us decide which strategies we want to use. The non-engagement approach, I think the book calls it the non-engagement strategy. We've already talked about avoidance, so I won't go on about that. But remember, avoidance is really walking away from a potential opportunity, but sometimes negotiations or conflict can be scary, and that's why we tend to avoid it. If you're able to meet your needs without negotiating at all, which is really the bottom line here, it may make sense to avoid the situation entirely. Remember, it's not an actual negotiation strategy. think of it as a goal strategy, which means, do I need to negotiate with this person? And if I'm afraid of them, that answer may be easier to come up with. If it's simply a matter of time and effort and you think, oh, why bother? Maybe you have a lot of alternatives. You have great BATNAs all over the place and you don't need to bother. That's another reason. And the last point here is what we've been dancing around, what we've been talking about, that the actual decision to negotiate is related to the desirability of your alternatives. So just like I was saying before, if you have a great BATNA, a great alternative, why would you be negotiating? If you're negotiating from the point of view of a vendor or selling something better, be it a product or service, keep in mind that if someone's negotiating with you, they likely see that as having more potential than whatever other alternatives there are. Otherwise, they wouldn't be there. So they might see it might be an opportunity. Now, it may not be a great opportunity. Maybe they're hoping to strike a really, really good deal where they save a ton of money. And if they don't, they'll just walk away and do their BATNA or whatever it is. But it's always about decision making from what your needs are, both substantive and relational. So keep that in mind. I often get the question, what makes a great negotiator, or how do I know I have a great agreement? To the first one, I'm not sure that there's one simple answer, what makes a great negotiator. I can tell you that a great negotiator knows themselves as people. They are really familiar and experienced with a number of different strategies and tactics so that they can switch back and forth without thinking about it too much. And they are good at communicating with people, listening carefully, that kind of thing. And what makes a great agreement? That is very subjective. And every situation will be a little bit different. Sometimes the people around you will tell you who you're accountable to. If you go back to the soccer field or football field diagram that we showed in the previous tutorial in part 1, you have to think about, who is in that level C seat, who's in the level D seat, and how much is that impacting me in this negotiation. And lastly, we're just going to look at this. We've already talked about this, but just to clarify, competition essentially means distributive. So much like you wouldn't put in a plan, I'm using distribution strategy or a distributive strategy, you would have to specify which specific distributive strategy you're using. Competition implies that this is a win-lose engagement. Collaboration, as we talked about before, is directly connected to being integrative or win-win oriented, often called mutual interest or mutual gains negotiation. And again, the accommodation one, when you're just giving in, I argue that's not really a strategy at all in terms of negotiation, because you're not really negotiating, you're just giving in. Now, there are degrees of how much we accommodate, and you can certainly use accommodation from time to time to give in if you have to do a compromise from time to time. Even though it's overall an integrative or win-win negotiation process, it's fine to do little compromises along the way just to speed things up, as long as you don't do it for the big stuff and you really focus on understanding each other's needs. So that about wraps it up for Chapter 4, and understanding again from a high-level view what negotiation, planning, and strategy are really all about. I recommend you go back to Chapter 2's video tutorial as well as Chapter 3's video tutorial to really understand the specific strategies for either distributive or integrative negotiation, as well as the tactics that go along with those strategies. It doesn't work when you take an integrative tactic and plug it into a distributive strategy. It doesn't fit. So make sure you don't mix and match those things when you do a plan. And have fun with your negotiation planning.